This is Simple Leadership. Welcome. We are here to learn from new and seasoned technology leaders who all share a passion for improving the craft of technology management. Let's take a deep dive into management and leadership challenges and best practices specific to software engineering and technology teams. Do you want more engineering management, leadership tactics, and information? Subscribe at simpleleadership.io to receive the latest updates from this podcast. Hi, I'm your host, Christian McCarrick. This is the Simple Leadership Podcast. Welcome back. Today's show is about setting the technical direction of your team with James Hood. James is a senior software developer at Amazon with about 15 years' experience in the software industry. He has worked in both Amazon Web Services and retail systems in solving problems at Amazon scale, which has fueled his passion for writing quality software that works at scale and teaching others how to do the same. Although he is a full-stack developer, his recent focus has been on serverless microservice architecture. Working in Amazon's culture of highly autonomous two-pizza teams for the last several years has provided experience that inspired his focus to form strong team cultures and offer mentoring to help teams avoid common pitfalls in software development. He also maintains a public blog to share his thoughts and learnings with the wider software community. Good afternoon, James. Welcome to the show.
Great. Hi. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, James, I wanted to start off a little bit, and some of our listeners are always interested in learning a little bit of the background of who my guests are on the show. So if you could not go through a whole list of a CV, but just sort of the highlights of your background, a little bit of kind of your education and how you kind of get up into the job you're right now at Amazon.
I graduated from the University of Arizona. I'm a native Tucson, Arizona. Graduated from the U of A with a degree in computer engineering, which is kind of a cross between software engineering and electrical engineering mixed,
Sure.
And minors in computer science and math. So I always knew I wanted to go into software, but I wanted to know a little more about the hardware, primarily just to help my programming. Entered the workforce and went into IBM. Worked on some pretty low-level device driver code for enterprise-level disk storage. Did that for about 6 years, and then made the jump to Amazon. Joined Amazon in Seattle. I'm coming up on 8 years at Amazon. I've worked in Amazon Web Services. I've worked in retail and fulfillment, specifically fulfillment software.
Mm-hmm.
I joined Amazon as an industry hire, but was promoted to a senior developer and have been a senior developer for several years now.
Great. Interesting going from sunny Arizona to Seattle. That must have been a little bit of a shift.
Yeah, believe it or not, having been raised in Tucson, it is actually possible to be sick of the sun. So far, so good. Rain is still magical to me growing up in the desert. So
Yeah. I'm actually looking at our window of the offices here, and I'm based in San Francisco, and it's sort of every 3 years or so it rains in June, and it's actually a kind of a rainy day here in the Bay.
Nice.
So interesting. And your team now, what kind of team are you on now, and how large is the team?
Yeah, so I work in the fulfillment software area. My team has grown since I joined it. I joined and it was your kind of standard two-pizza team, which consists of 5 to 8 to 10 developers or so, plus manager and program managers. However, it's the vision of the team has grown, and so we're now an organization of multiple teams. And I serve in a mentoring role to several two-pizza teams. And then I generally will focus specifically with one team that's maybe working on a very high impact or high risk area where I am part of the team and a developer on the team, but with mentoring of other teams and trying to make sure that kind of herd everybody in the same direction at a high level.
Sure. And when you talk about mentoring at your standpoint, that's predominantly, as we talk about mentoring on the coding and architecture, kind of team and project-based stuff, right?
Yeah, there's so Amazon has these two pizza teams, and so your team has very strong ownership. You own one or more services top to bottom. So you generally function a little more like a startup, whereas people wear many different hats. And although, my primary role is as a software developer, I'm trying to think of things from the product standpoint. I'm trying to think from the management standpoint so that, and everyone tries to be able to think from the different roles so that we can push on each other and make sure that we're all holding each other accountable and also operating as lean as possible. But in terms of mentoring, I'm generally mentoring software developers, helping them with their career path, with individual growth, and hopefully leading a lot by example with my own coding or code reviews. And then I also mentor teams in terms of design. So they'll come to me with, I'll checkpoint with them at some regular interval, understand their designs, give feedback, and try to help shape the direction that they're going.
Okay. And is this sort of a formal arrangement that has happened, or did you just sort of step into this mentorship role?
It kind of happened organically. So essentially, and this is how I always suggest ideally mentoring starts is, everybody has strengths and weaknesses. And so there are certain things that you do very, very well. And there are things that I do very, very well. And people just started asking, how do I do that? And so it turned into kind of a mentoring relationship of how do I do that? And trying to help them to grow themselves and just share my strengths essentially with others. And then I found myself repeating the same things over and over and over again. And so then it started becoming, that's where my blog came from, was just a way to scale. And now I can just refer them to different blog entries, and which saves me time. Then, having all of these different teams as the organization grew and having all these different teams, I saw things going in kind of disparate directions. And I wanted to preserve the Two Pizza team culture of the teams are autonomous and they can set their own direction. But I also wanted to be able to check in with them. And so the mechanism I found that worked for that was these checkpoints. So I formally set those up and made it very clear to the teams. I set some ground rules that, they own their software, they own the path forward. I'm there to help in any way that I can. And hopefully my experience is something that they do find valuable and helpful, but I also find the time valuable because I get to learn about what they're doing, learn about technologies they're using that maybe I haven't used. So it's, I try to keep it very much a two-way conversation as opposed to being any kind of gatekeeper role that would slow people down.
One of the questions I have as well, and as obviously companies scale and grow, different people step into various needed leadership roles. What is how do you differentiate between sort of the manager of the teams and what you're doing as this kind of mentoring technical leadership role?
For me, the managers are really focused on the business, especially product management, program managers. They're focused very much on the business. So what are the business problems that are trying to be solved? Really trying to gain a deep understanding of the customer and their needs, and then communicating that back to the development teams. So my role is different. So at Amazon, everybody tries to be customer obsessed. So we try very hard to understand our customers. Everybody does. However, developers, I guess the way I would separate it is managers are very concerned with the business problems. And then on the development side, developers are coming up with the technical solutions to solve these business problems. And a big part of what I do and what my role has grown into is not only coming up with a solution to their problem today, but trying to come up with a solution that's extensible enough and isolated. It's abstracted enough so that as new needs and new asks come in, we can add to our solution in a way that where it stays maintainable and it still makes sense.
Sure. And you mentioned sort of customer focused and customer obsession. I believe that's one of the Amazon principles, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the first one.
The first one. So, I mean, tell me a little bit, because when you talk about your blog post, how to set technical direction from your team, which is actually how I found you to be on the show. You mentioned the Amazon leadership principles. Give me a little bit of an overview, without necessarily going into detail to everyone, but I know you mentioned two of them that are important in this technical direction in your blog post.
Sure. So, yeah, Amazon has these leadership principles, and one thing I say in my blog entry that really holds true for me is, I've heard from others, and I've also been at companies where there are corporate values or principles that really are just kind of these very kind of platitudes that are maybe put on a poster and stuck on a wall somewhere, and nobody really looks at them, and they don't necessarily make a big difference in your daily activity at work. And the thing that really strikes me about the Amazon leadership principles is that we live and breathe them every day. That we literally use the phrases, customer obsession and bias for action and earn trust. And we use them in daily conversation. They just are interwoven throughout every team at Amazon. And that's actually very important because Amazon's a highly decentralized company. Mm-hmm. So in order to have some semblance of, organization among the chaos, there needs to be some common thread between them. And the leadership principles really are that. And they really come from, I believe they come from the behavior of Jeff Bezos himself and kind of some examples that he's set, and then over time have grown into a way to scale this behavior and this thought process.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, and I agree with that concept of whether it's your leadership principles or some teams or companies have manifestos, and it's just something really to help drive that culture. And you really feel that those leadership principles really help drive the culture there at Amazon?
Definitely. I think they're critical. They're critical to making sure that, things like customer obsession, things where yes, we may look at what competitors are doing, but we obsess over customers and think problems that they have now, and even solutions that they don't even know they need, right? We're just trying to advocate. One thing that's said frequently is that, the most important person, the customer, is the one person who's not in the conference room as you're there discussing solutions. And so everyone needs to do their best to try to advocate for that person who can't be there directly. Mm-hmm. So and I think, again, that comes straight from Jeff himself, and we work backwards from the customer and try to do the right thing for them. I also think as an online company, as a company where it's, I think with the internet today, with security concerns, with privacy concerns, with those kind of things, really trying to put yourself in the shoes of the customer and do the right thing for the customer. One thing I love about being here is it creates the right incentive. You're really incentivized to truly do the right thing or do your best to do the right thing. And so that's very rewarding.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, the title of again, your blog post, how to set the technical direction for your team. I often, I think it's also important to set that the technical direction should also stem from sort of the company goals and direction. Now, how does that information flow with you, and how do you translate that business direction into, your team's technical direction?
Yeah. So again, that comes back to kind of the roles managers play versus developers. So the business direction is something that management really owns. They want to make progress in a particular business. They see an opportunity, or they see a way to expand in a particular market segment, for example, and they bring the problem, and they kind of do this. So in this blog post, I talk about having a long-term direction and then a short-term kind of deliverable, and that you need to have both, and you need to have that balance. And from a business standpoint, management needs to provide that. They need to provide, here's the direction we want to go for this business, but here's a short-term way that we can see that we can accomplish that. Maybe here's step one. Sure. And then on the technical side for developers, I try to take both of those inputs and then turn that into a technical direction, which to me is a solution. And the long-term, it includes a long-term architecture that you can see will be able to meet kind of those long-term needs and ideally be flexible in the right places. So it's always a tough balance trying to not create the solution that's trying to solve everybody's problems, right? You have to keep it constrained, but something that is directional and seems to align with the business direction as well. And then provide that short-term solution to the business step one that they gave you.
Correct. And I like in the article how you do, both for your short-term and long-term goals section that you have, is talking about tying in that business and why you're doing it, and the business wins as well as the technical wins for doing what you're doing. I think so often, especially in Silicon Valley, people sometimes tend to do technology for technology's sake without necessarily tying that back into the business need or the customer improvement that technology will actually enable.
Yeah, and I have to say, we can be guilty of that as well. It is very, very important to tie it back to the business need. There is an argument of, I've seen talks from Google before where they've talked about having things that were business failures, but technical wins that were used elsewhere later. Sure. And that's a nice fallback, but ideally you succeed in the business as well. And not everybody has the same cushion that Google or Amazon does, especially in the startup world.
That's right. There's not enough sort of runway to be able to take those losses and build them into something else. Now, one of the things in the article too, you mentioned that I liked, you referenced is the mapping of the code base, and how you thought that was a very interesting thing to look at your entire architecture. Why don't you describe that for a minute?
Sure. So Simon Brown is somebody I follow, and he's written and given talks extensively about your architecture as code and visualizing architecture as maps of your code base. So, the hallmark of an architect is that you can draw rectangles, cylinders, and arrows, right? But, although a picture is worth 1,000 words, it's not very useful if many people look at the picture and they all come back with a different 1,000 words, right? Mm-hmm. So a picture can be valuable, but it's also incredibly hard to draw one picture that effectively communicates your architecture to many people. And especially as your organization grows, you really need that clarity. So Simon Brown's concept is nice because it just admits that you can't put this all in one picture. People will not be able to really glean all of the information you're trying to convey. So he views it kind of like Google Maps, where you, depending on your level of zoom in and out, you'll see different levels of abstraction or detail. Mm-hmm. And so I love that concept, and I use that in my architecture diagrams to try to simplify. So you start at this high level where you just show the system as one block, and you give context of who are the key actors and dependencies on the system. And then you zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, and you can communicate different things. So I really like that concept. Another concept that I haven't blogged about yet, I did that internally in Amazon, but haven't put it externally. One thing in block diagrams is, the arrows represent relationships, but I frequently see a lot of diagrams with arrows, and the arrows aren't really labeled. Mm-hmm. And so it can be confusing what the exact relationship is. And one trick that seems so simple when you say it, but the trick is to label the arrows. So what I like to do is I think of the blocks or components as nouns, and then the arrows are the connectors, right? And so they should be like a verb or an action. And I actually will create diagrams where you can read, if you follow the arrows, you should be able to read some kind of logical sentence. And that's been very helpful for me because, again, it makes it so that everybody or most everybody is taking the same key conclusions away from your picture.
Correct. And you do mention about that and communication. And communication, I feel, whether it's in management, whether it's in mentorship, whether it's in setting direction for teams, having a common language, right, a common set of syntax and vocabulary, as well as, tell me how do you help on a communication level drive that level of direction? Is it written, like you're talking about in these block diagrams? Is it codified in wikis, or do you give talks? So tell me a little bit how the communication flow actually happens.
Sure. It's generally a mix of a few of those things. So I will write documents. As a developer, I prefer documents that are in a place that are very easy for people to access. So internally, we have wikis and systems like that are fairly easy for people to access. So I like using that as my medium. And I'll create documents that are essentially that architectural vision, that kind of long-term vision. And then there's a document that's the short-term detailed, this is exactly what we're going to do. And in that long-term vision document, for example, I do include these different views of the system, like the map of the system, and then try to put key overarching design points. The thing that's tricky about the long-term vision is that your design points need to be things that are relatively stable over time. So what are the big for example, what are the major components of your system? What are the big roles that they have in the system? That's what I'm trying to establish in the long-term direction. So those kind of key tenets or design points, I try to put those in that document. Then I try to follow them up with these different views where I present the picture, and then I put some bullet points under it that are honestly, what it comes down to is they should essentially be, if you were reading the diagram and reading the labels on the edges, my bullet points generally tend to just be those. And because your picture should communicate those key relationships and key concepts and key interactions. So I just reiterate them in bullet points. I may walk through kind of a high level use case again, the whole point is to try to establish what are the key components of the system and how are they going to interact to provide this solution.
Sure.
And so I'll write that document. I don't like to write that in an isolated, siloed kind of environment. So there's usually working sessions where I'm working with maybe key developers and management as well. And we're having working sessions where we're discussing through, and then the document is kind of an artifact of that we've all talked and kind of agreed on this solution. And then after that, then I'll share it with the larger group. And I generally will call a meeting with the larger group and kind of walk through the document and answer anyone's questions and add their questions to the document. I always have a section for open questions and answered questions or FAQs. Sure. And try to make sure that the picture makes sense to everyone on the team and that there aren't any major outstanding questions.
Sure. And you do mention that Amazon teams are fairly autonomous. How do you deal with sort of really do you have any cross team type dependencies, and how does that communication happen as it relates to sort of any technical kind of interfaces?
Yeah, it's interesting because as a decentralized company, it's a conscious decision that there will be a trade-off where in order for teams to be autonomous, coordination costs between teams are surprisingly expensive. Yeah. And not in a way that's easy to see initially and easy to measure. And so sometimes it is the right decision if a team has some component that has been in production for a while, it's stable, it's common, it's exactly what you need. Absolutely. Take it, use it. That team will be very happy that they have other users as well. However, it is common to also get some duplication happening where a team decides, I don't need that full shiny thing. I just need this little thing to get moving, and your team's direction's kind of different from mine. So I'm not sure that I can rely on your team to change your software a little bit to fit what I need. So I might just build it myself, and in order to move. So that's a conscious trade-off that's made. That does happen. That can be a little shocking or frustrating to engineers who first come into Amazon. And but again, it's that coordination cost is very expensive. However, sometimes you need cross-cutting, or sometimes it just makes sense to collaborate with other teams. And actually, that long-term vision has been extremely helpful for me to establish where that commonality is, because if you show that to a team, they may not they may not see alignment in your first step in what you're doing, but that long-term view, I've actually very successfully used that before to get other teams bought in, saying, oh, I like the direction you're going. It actually aligns quite a bit with ours. Maybe if we tweak it a little bit, then we'll be fully aligned and we can collaborate on this. So that long-term vision has been very effective for doing that.
Mm-hmm. Good. No, good. And, from switching from your long-term section you had in your blog post over to the short-term, one of the things you have in there is your impact versus effort matrix. And I think a lot of people are familiar with that. Various quadrants: high impact, high effort, low impact, low effort, and so on. How do you decide then with the managers about what's working? How do you get movement and momentum, on those high impact, low effort items?
Sure. It comes in different ways. Again, there's that bias for action leadership principle. Sometimes there's just a little bit of a just do it. Sure. As a senior developer, sometimes if I'm trying to organize a larger effort and I'm not on a specific team, sometimes that is what I end up doing. If I see an opportunity for something that seems like low-hanging fruit, I think a valid criticism of this is, yes, that makes sense, but it's not always easy to understand what is high effort, low effort, and what is high impact, especially the impact, right?
Yeah.
And understanding what that is. And so as a senior developer, sometimes I will do what we call a spike, and I'll try to create a quick prototype, essentially trying to test a hypothesis that we believe this is high impact. So let me do a spike. Let's test it in a simple way with maybe a very small set of users and try to understand whether this is worth going after, whether it's really as small as we think it is, and whether it does have the impact we think it does before investing heavily into it. So having an individual who's just motivated to do that and allowing them to do that spike is very valid for gathering more data.
And you guys have the autonomy in your teams and the authority to do these small proof of concepts that might impact maybe 0.5% of users or whatnot, and actually put them into production?
Yes. I mean, you have to take the appropriate. So there are, we definitely have A/B testing kind of infrastructure that allows you to kind of put these in and turn them on for certain percentages of users. So that's incredibly useful for limiting any kind of blast radius. We do have a culture. I mean, it varies throughout teams, but all the infrastructure is in place for you to have very high QA, like automated testing and quality to minimize any impact of just breaking regular functionality by making these changes. It depends on the team. It depends on what their current roadmap is. I've found, the talented managers are the ones who can effectively balance the two, like let their team go off and try a spike of something. But in general, Amazon as a company is very tolerant of experiments and failure as long as you learn from it.
Sure. And it doesn't take the entire site down.
Right? Please don't do
failure
that.
within reason. Right?
Yep.
One of the things too that you talk about that I think I see all the time too is this concept of analysis paralysis, right? Where as a leader, oftentimes I've experienced over the time of my career, you get teams and they'll argue, or I didn't say argue, but discuss heavily a framework or direction, and at the end of the day, they could have gone in either path, and it probably would have had almost no difference in the outcome. right? Now, how do you deal with sort of as a kind of leader on your teams, getting people over that analysis paralysis and actually getting to make a decision? What tools do you have for helping your teams do that?
Sure. A couple things. So the long term, so one thing I hope, I don't know that I got through very effectively in this blog entry, is that the long-term vision is the main focus of it is directional. So don't get stuck on it. It's something that you can rat hole on it and you can go forever and ever and spin on it. And I try to time box that effort and say, okay, long term, are we directionally aligned? Do we kind of all understand where we're going? Just trying to draw the big lines between certain components. This will do this and it won't do what this other component does because X, right? And just defining those things, but then quickly moving on to, okay, what are we actually going to deliver? What's the short term? So the long-term vision is very easy to get into that analysis paralysis phase because it's just too murky. You can't solve all the problems for the next 5 years now. It's not worth it. For the short term, the other place I see analysis paralysis is where there are unknowns and risk, where nobody can agree because we just don't know. And one of the most effective directors I've worked under he was so great about just saying, well, let's just try it. and that spirit is what I like to do to kind of try to break that. You have a rough solution. This is what we think we're going to do. This, I think we can put these existing components together in this way to solve this process. But you identify kind of these big unknown areas. And rather than debating endlessly on something that no one will really know the answer to until you do it, I prefer prototyping. And I mean prototyping in the true sense, not something you hack together and then put into, and then somebody throws it in production and then it becomes your production product. But that's right. Right. To me, a true prototype is where you have it's a scientific experiment. It's where you have a hypothesis, you build the bare minimal thing to test that hypothesis and then try it and then probably throw it away. So hopefully throw it away if it's literally thrown together. So there's two levels of that, right? So your short-term MVP or business deliverable, that might be testing a business hypothesis, but you need to build that with quality because you'll tamper with the results if you have bugs, is the best way I like to put it. You won't be able to get a good data on whether your hypothesis was right if it's full of bugs and maybe the user's not hooking onto it because it just doesn't work, right? So that needs to be defined.
Excellent point.
Yeah, so that part needs quality. However, the hypothesis is more of a technical concern. Like we think this dependency, we think that this service that this other team has can do what we need. Let's write a quick set of integration tests and simulate what we're going to do with it and make sure that's true. So that's more what I mean by prototyping, is just vetting your dependencies, vetting certain concepts, and making sure that they work.
They're great. And I think that analysis paralysis goes from down to the junior individual contributor, all the way up to corporate boards and whatnot. I was just reading an article this week that talked about what they found that the most effective CEOs do are the ones that actually not always make the right decisions, but make sort of the quickest decisions. So that failing fast and doing the experiments to ultimately get to the right decision over time, right? But get there quicker than some of the competition. Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I read that I loved was about planes and how they course correct. That a plane is, I don't remember the exact percentage, but it's something like a plane is off course 95% of the time, but they're constantly course correcting, right? Yeah. And as long as they're checking frequently enough, then they simulate a straight line to the destination. Right. That's right. Over the large distance. Right?
Exactly.
Yep. And going back again to your culture, the anonymous and the two pizza teams at Amazon, how do you think that those leadership principles and that sense of autonomy really helps to almost force good leadership and force people to become more effective leaders for those teams?
I think it does. I mean, so again, there's trade-offs, but I think one thing that really helps is you have a lot less risk of diffusion of responsibility. I mean, one of the leadership principles is ownership, that we have very strong ownership. And internally, our software, this is public knowledge that we use a service-oriented architecture in Amazon. And each team owns one or more services top to bottom. So if you're a two pizza team, you do the design, you build it, you write the tests, automated testing, you deploy it to production, you do on-call pager support for it. I mean, you fully own it. Yeah. And that ownership really is very powerful because diffusion of responsibility is where things can really go sideways. But when everyone on the team feels very strong ownership, then you're going to have passionate discussions about where it should go and how you should move. And then on top of that, being the small size of the team forces you to be kind of scrappy and utilize your resources as efficiently as possible.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you talk about some of those spirited discussions, is there, do your teams have sort of a final arbiter, whether it's on a technical direction or, which feature or something to add at one time? Is that sort of the manager, or is that a group discussion? How does that work?
Well, hopefully nobody has to really step in and say, okay, we're forcing. Sometimes your manager needs to act as a facilitator and say, okay, we're going to draw the line. It depends on the experience level of the team. If it's mostly junior developers, then the managers at Amazon are expected to be very technical. And so, so the manager can step in and act as that. On the teams who have a senior developer, then ideally the senior developers help with those kind of making those decisions. So, but again, this comes back to leadership principles. There's actually one that's called have backbone and disagree and commit. And Jeff Bezos every year writes these very well written letters to his shareholders. And this last year, he actually talks about disagree and commit and gives an example of him doing that it's not a passive thing. It's actually, you argue for your point, you argue, and don't just give in because it's uncomfortable or because you want to achieve some kind of social cohesion in your group. Like, you argue respectfully but forcefully for your position. But once a decision is made, then you actively commit to it. And he even gives an example of actually saying, I'm disagreeing and committing on this. And that's very powerful because it does push you to have these difficult conversations and but then ultimately be aligned as a team. One trick that I've used, or one tip that I've used a lot, is when we get stuck on maybe we have two options and the team just cannot seem to move forward on that. I like to try as much as possible to take the personal, like my idea versus your idea, out of the equation. And I'll go to the whiteboard and we'll say, okay, what are our options? And we'll list out the options, and then we'll do a pros and cons exercise. But the idea is to have everyone brainstorm the pros and cons for every option to try to remove that personal feeling of bias. This is my idea. Yeah. Yep. And sometimes that's enough. And then one emerges as the clear winner. And in other cases, I think it's Steve McConnell in Code Complete. He has this great line where he says, if you have two good options, just pick one.
That's right. That's right. No, I mean, I agree with that. Right, it gets out of that again, that paralysis you have. I also was reading a interesting article about the concept of having two different meetings when you're really going through a decision process, and you separate the actual decision meeting from what you're talking about, which is sort of that pros and cons and that discovery process, and you physically make them separate so that you don't have to have that concept of having to make that decision that particular day, and you're focused really on, as you mentioned, getting all the information out, and everyone feels, I think, a little bit more free if they feel like, oh, this is just information, we're not making a decision and I have to lean one way or the other yet.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
So one of the other things too I want to get to here towards the end, I think to be any effective leader, senior engineering, management, leadership, time management is, I think, crucial piece of being successful at that. And I think you've also written in your blog a little bit about your to-do list, and you have a tip for handling your to-do list on a daily basis. Just tell me a little bit about how that has helped you to manage both the mentorship you do, this blog posting you do, and the teams and the work you do on the teams themselves.
Yeah, sure. I guess what it comes down to is I am a slave to efficiency is one way that I like to put it. I just want to be as efficient as possible. And part of that is one background note that I give generally is that my wife and I met very young. We were 19 and in college. I was married shortly after college, and we started having kids very quickly after that. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't have kind of now it's very common for new developers to have a period of several years where they're single and sure. They can just put as much time as possible into work. And I had a very strong desire to, spend time with my family and be a good husband and father. So it forced me to limit my work hours, which then forced me to be as efficient as possible. This to-do list that I blog about, it doesn't sound like much, but the principles behind it are that I recognize I can only have a certain number of things on that list at a time. And I have a pretty hard limit of 4, maybe 5, but generally 3 to 4 things on that list. Mm-hmm. They're in priority order, and I maintain it every day. So it's something that I'm always revisiting. Am I working on the most important things? Am I working on the most important things? And do I have too many things on my plate? And if any of those things are true, something has to give, and I have sure. to cut. I have to reprioritize, maybe talk with my manager, maybe delegate if possible. The other piece of that to-do list is I record my accomplishments for each day, and they can seem little, but there's actually a huge psychological benefit to tracking even the small wins every day. And in my blog post, I talk about how it can be used at performance review time as well as kind of a nice log of what you did. But the keys for me are just ruthless prioritization and treating your time as a very, very important resource.
Yeah, one of the things that you do mention in there is giving that sort of list of accomplishments, especially at the end of your review time, to your boss. And I have to say to listeners out there, anything you can do to make your boss's life easier at the annual performance review time is worth it. Coming from both sides of that fence, I will, it's almost like Christmas time if someone gives me some well-formatted documents of things they've had throughout the year. It's almost subconsciously increases that review slightly. Right?
Yeah, and along those same lines, when I maintain my own to-do list, I'm maintaining my own schedule, essentially, of what I do, which is very empowering for me personally, but it also offloads work for my manager, where it's not that I'm coming to them saying, what should I do? What should I do? I'm communicating to them, this is my current priority, and here's what I'm doing. And I'm always open to feedback and open to them coming in and helping me and reprioritizing, but I control my schedule ideally, right? And that actually helps management because they don't have to handhold me the whole time.
Correct. And that level of autonomy and control you have, I think psychologically also is helpful for you. It probably makes you feel better about your day-to-day as well.
Absolutely.
So one quick question about, do you mix your sort of personal to-do list and a work to-do list? Do you have two, or how do you handle that?
Yeah, I keep them separate. I definitely keep them separate. I have a kind of a weekend to-do list.
Sure, the honey-do list.
Exactly. It really is. It really is. No, I'll say I'm not as strict with the only 3 to 4 things rule either.
Yes, and I'm sure you're not the only one adding things to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing. I might have to have maybe a kind of a group podcast episode in the future, maybe specifically with balancing that live-work balance, especially with engineers and engineering leaders who do have families. And I think that might warrant a whole other episode, because there's a lot of people that are kind of maturing through the ranks and getting a little older. And I think that would be worthwhile to hear people and how we all manage to do it and still be successful and sane.
Yeah, that'd be a great topic. I always enjoy talking about that, especially at Amazon. It does have a bit of a reputation, and it's always refreshing for people when they see how much I'm able to get done and still have a very active personal and social life as well.
Great. James, as we wrap up here, any kind of last comments or thoughts that to impart around the sort of the technical direction and setting that for your team?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. So this post is kind of the culmination of trial and error in a number of ways. And I've some pitfalls that I've definitely run into is, you really need to have both. And I have had situations where I just set the long-term vision, and then everyone's very excited about it, but they don't see a path there. And then we're kind of spinning our wheels because maybe the other engineers on the team just want to build that. But that's like a 3 to 5 year project, right? So both of the short-term and long-term are really critical. Being able to look at it from the business side as well and make sure that you're not building ivory towers. I've definitely walked that line as well, and you're not just building, like you said, technology for technology's sake, that you're also really working closely with the business and ultimately trying to solve the customer's problem and the business problem as well. I don't know that the blog post stresses that, but I would stress those as very, very important.
Great. No, great. Thank you for that. So listeners, we've been listening to James Hood, a senior software engineer at Amazon and also a blogger, which I have a lot of respect for, actually having that time to actually give back to the community outside of Amazon as well. Thank you for doing that. And also any of the links we have, I'll put James's information, his blog information, links, and any social media he has in the show notes that you can look at after the show. You can go visit them at simpleleadership.io, and this episode will be posted there as well as iTunes, and you can see the show notes that we have there. James, thank you very much again for being on the show this afternoon. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for asking.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Simple Leadership Podcast, hosted by me, Christian McCarrick. If you have enjoyed the show, please subscribe and don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Full show notes and additional information can be found on simpleleadership.io. If you know someone who would be a great guest for the show, or you want to share your own experiences, please drop me a line. We'll see you back next week for more technology leadership tips and advice as I interview more top software engineering leaders.